Federalist 30, Part 3, Hamilton is discussing the issue of revenue, money for the treasury of the government, taxation, what is a fair method of taxation, and the fact that the way the Confederacy has worked under the Articles of Confederation has not been good for the credit and the standing of the United States. It's making us look weak, and it's going to cause a lot of trouble down the road, because if you don't get enough money, we can't pay our debts. If we can't pay our debts, we won't have good credit. And when the emergency comes, we want to have investment in the country, or somebody invades us, we need to borrow some money. Nobody will give us credit. So he's talking about all those things and the shortcomings of the Articles of the Confederation. Articles of Confederation were very weak. Okay, I will start reading again. What remedy can there be for this situation, but in a change of the system which has produced it in a change of the fallacious and delusive system of quotas and requisitions? What substitute can there be imagined for this ignis fatuus in finance, but that of permitting the national government to raise its own revenues by the ordinary methods of taxation authorized in every well-ordered constitution of civil government? The reason this is important is because in the new constitution, it says that the federal government can tax people directly. In the Articles of Confederation, you couldn't do that. You had to make requisitions to the states. But here in this new constitution, it says you can tax people directly, people in different states, and that's what anti-federalists don't like. Ingenious men may declaim with plausibility on any subject, but no human ingenuity can point out any other expedient to rescue us from the inconveniences and embarrassments naturally resulting from the defective supplies of the public treasury. The more intelligent adversaries of the new constitution admit the force of this reasoning, but they qualify the admission by a distinction between what they call internal, in capital letters, and external taxation. So he says, some of the people that criticize us agree with us that we need to be able to tax directly. But they say that the federal government can only tax external stuff, things that come from the ports, the imports. But internal taxation should be left to the states. The former they would reserve to the state governments. The latter, which they explain into commercial imposts, or rather duties on imported articles, they declare themselves willing to concede to the federal head. This distinction, however, would violate the maxim of good sense and sound policy, which dictates that every power ought to be in proportion to its object. In other words, when you give the government some responsibilities and duties, it has to have enough power to actually do it. And for the government to be able to do its job, can't tie the government's hand back and say you can't have revenue, you can't have resources from a whole lot of things. So he says you got to be reasonable. And would still leave the general government, that's the federal government, in a kind of tutelage to the state governments. In other words, the federal government again becomes like a beggar that has to constantly ask the state governments for money. Inconsistent with every idea of vigor or efficiency. Who can pretend that commercial imposts are or would be alone equal to the present and future exigencies of the Union, taking into the account the existing debts, foreign and domestic, upon any plan of extinguishment which a man moderately impressed with the informants of public justice and public credit could approve, in addition to the establishments which all parties will acknowledge to be necessary, we could not reasonably flatter ourselves that this resource alone, upon the most improved scale, would even suffice for its present necessities. He says, add all the money we owe to what we need to operate this government. Anybody with common sense that can do a little bit of math can figure out that only putting taxes on imports, it's not going to take care of it. Its future necessities admit not of calculation or limitation, and upon the principle more than once adverted to, more than once talked about, the power of making provision for them as they arise out to be equally unconfined. I believe it may be regarded as a position warranted by the history of mankind. The history of mankind teaches us this, that in the usual progress of things, the necessities of a nation in every stage of its existence will be found at least equal to its resources. In other words, he says, think of the future. As we go forward, we're going to need more. Things are going to happen where if we want to build a canal and we want people to invest there, they might say, no, your income, your revenue is not good. We won't do it. Your credit is not good. We won't do it. Or let's say a country invades us. How are we going to fight them? If we just put taxes on the imports, and let's say the country that's invading us and is stronger, has a naval blockade, won't let anything come in, we're not going to have any imports, let alone any taxes on those imports. So how is this government going to make its money? So he says, you've got to be reasonable and think and stay ahead of the game. So you have to have other sources of revenue, other sources of money for the treasury, maybe taxing your people to save the day. Otherwise, you might just be invaded and can do nothing about it, and you'll be colonized again. To say that deficiencies may be provided for by requisitions upon the states is on the one hand to acknowledge that this system cannot be depended upon, and on the other hand to depend upon it for everything beyond a certain limit. Those who have carefully attended to its vices and deformities as they have been exhibited by the experience or delineated in the course of these papers, in other words, we've already seen by experience and also talked about it in these last Federalist Papers, that the method of requisition this past few years has not worked. Must feel invincible repugnancy to trusting the national interests in any degree to its operation. Its inevitable tendency, whenever it is brought into activity, must be to enfeeble the Union and sow the seeds of discord and contention before the federal head and its members and between the members themselves. So he says, we talked about it in another Federalist Papers, and experience has shown us that when you make requisitions, Some of the states will pay, some of them won't, and before you know it, the state that pays on time is going to hate the state that doesn't pay on time. So you sow the seeds of discord and contention in the future that will get us into wars. Can it be expected that the deficiencies would be better supplied in this mode than the total wants of the Union have heretofore been supplied in the same mode? It ought to be recollected that if less will be required from the states, they will have proportionately less means to answer the demand. If the opinions of those who contend for the distinction which has been mentioned were to be received as evidence of truth, one would be led to conclude that there was some known point in the economy of national affairs at which it would be safe to stop and say, thus far the ends of public happiness will be promoted by supplying the wants of government, and all beyond this is unworthy of our care or anxiety. How is it possible that a government half supplied and always necessitous can fulfill the purposes of its institution, can provide for the security, advance the prosperity, or support the reputation of commonwealth? So if we don't have enough money coming in, like these people who are our critics say, no, you can only tax the imports and nothing else. He says, in the middle of a battle, when we are invaded, we're just going to put our hands up and say, sorry, I don't have enough money because my government doesn't allow me, or my constitution doesn't allow me to get money from my people to run the war. Says, we might as well just think of this as an empty plan, an empty constitution, has no meaning, it can't get its job done, and we will be laughed at